So what we're going to do, Sam, is set up a worm bin for harvesting here today. This is a worm bin. We're going to be dumping it out and separating the worms and the bedding from the worm castings. The worm castings are what we're collecting to feed the plants. So that's what this process is all about, is collecting the worm castings so you have something to feed the plants. Okay, so while you're sifting, and that's how we do the separating of the worm castings, we use a sieve. It looks like this. It has 1/8 inch square holes in it, and that's what the castings go through and the worms stay on top of. So when we put that sieve into this thing and start shaking it back and forth, you need to have something underneath this to hold it in place, and that's why you put a non-skid pad underneath it. Okay, so that's what we're going to be sifting into. We have to dump out the worm bin into something else, and that's what the second tote is for, is to dump the worm bin. So we're going to take the worm bin apart. I can talk a little bit about it as I'm taking it apart. It has holes in the lid for air to get in. Worms need air so they can breathe. So I keep a log sheet on each worm bin. I have, right now in the worm farm, I have 59 of these. So if I want to know what's happening in any particular worm bin, I have to have a log sheet. So I record things like, when did I last feed this? How long has it been since I fed it? When was the last time I harvested it? Did I see any flies in it the last time I was looking at it, and so forth. So that's the kind of information I keep on the log sheet. This is a cover to keep flies out of the worm bin, and if you have flies inside the worm bin, it keeps them in so they can't escape and get into the house and cause annoyance. It's held on with a couple of elastic devices to keep it nice and tight. So when I take a cover off, I'm careful to make sure that there's no flies, so I roll it back. If I did see any flies, I'd stop, take it outside, beat on the sides of it, and let the flies fly out outside rather than inside the house. Fly paper is mounted inside the worm bin on a piece of paper like so, so if there are flies in there, hopefully you'll catch them on the fly paper before they have a chance to mate and reproduce. One fly can lay 700 eggs. So you go from one fly to 700 to 700 times 700 in a very short period of time, which ends up with what we call a fly infestation. The next thing that we have in here are a few sections of dry newspaper. The purpose of these is to keep the walls dry. If the walls are wet from condensation and it's dark, your worms are going to crawl right out of your worm bin and get out on the floor around the worm bin. So by keeping dry paper in the top, you hold the moisture that's in the air that would otherwise condense on the walls. So it keeps the walls dry, and it keeps everything underneath dark. Worms don't like light, so that's also keeping it dark. This little piece of plastic separates what's moist. Everything underneath the plastic is moist. Everything on top of the plastic is dry. So that's what that does. It prevents moisture from making the paper on top of it moist. And then we have a couple of sections of paper in here that are old newspaper that came from the bottom of a previous worm bin. And you can see how the worms actually eat right straight through the paper.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so worms do eat the paper. They also eat the food that's in the worm bin when it gets to be soft. Worms don't have teeth, so they have to depend on other things in the worm bin to break the food down and make it soft enough so that they can ingest it. So this is just to help keep me organized as I'm taking this thing apart. These are wet, so if I put them in between a couple of sheets or a couple of trays like that, then this whole thing can be put out of the way while I'm doing the harvest. So this worm bin was fed roughly 35 days ago. All kinds of kitchen scraps, banana peels and and apple cores and onion and you name it, and you can see that everything is gone except for a few items like grape stems. They take a long time to decompose. Like a flower stem, they take a long time to decompose. They will eventually. There's a piece of onion skin that also hasn't decomposed, but everything else in here has turned into worm castings. There is no soil in this worm bin. All you see that looks like soil is actually worm castings, and that's what we're now going to harvest. So we'll dump out the worm bin. So that's an empty worm bin now. We'll set that up for another 3 to 4 months, what we call harvest cycle. To do that, we're going to put 2 pounds of newspaper. So the reason 2 pounds is food has a lot of water in it. And when food decomposes, that water is released and it goes by gravity towards the bottom of your worm bin. So in order to soak up that moisture so that it doesn't get muddy, we use dry newspaper in the bottom of the worm bin to soak up that moisture. I have a wooden base that goes in, usually that goes in very close to the bottom, a little bit of dry paper underneath it. And every 3 to 4 months we have to change the diaper. So we call this a worm bin diaper, and it's soaking up leachate from the food, and it keeps your worm bin what I call moist and crumbly. And the reason that that's important is, number one, when you're trying to sift through a sieve, if your worm castings are moist and crumbly, they're going to break up and they're going to go through the sieve. If they're too wet, they're going to stick together. And I use the example of snow. If you have wet snow, it makes a good snowball, it sticks together. If you have dry snow, it breaks up and goes through. We want dry snow kind of worm castings to go through, but we don't want them too dry because the worms have to live in an environment that is moist so that their skin stays moist so they can breathe. This is what I call the old diaper. It is been in there for 3 to 4 months now, and it's moist but not soaking wet, so it still can absorb moisture. And you want to change the diaper before it gets too wet, and that way it can work. If it's too wet, then it won't work for you. And I'm going to put a little bit of this moist paper in on top of the dry paper, just so that when the worms go back in the worm bin, they aren't going to end up going right down on top of dry paper.
Kind of like a starter.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is all extra. Now I use this to make bedding for the worm bin. The worms eat the paper, eat the bedding, and after a while you have to replace it, and this is what I use to replace the bedding with. Put it over here, just it's extra right now. Okay, so this is what a dumped out worm bin looks like when it's ready to harvest. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a hand cultivator to kind of break it up. It's easier to break this stuff up with a hand cultivator in the bin than it is to try to break it up in the sieve. Get it so it's not in any clumps. Okay, so now we're going to stick this over here. These are the normal tools that I'm using in this process. I use a 2-quart measure, gloves if you want them, paintbrush to move castings around, rubber, if the castings are a little stickier, you have to use that. The rest of this stuff is sort of extra supplies. We're going to take 2 quarts of this material, put it in the sieve, and sit there. Okay, so this is now the separated, the worms are in here, the bedding is in here, any food that hasn't decomposed is in here. All of that's going back into the worm bin. Here's the worm castings. that have been separated out from the worms and the bedding. The reason that I put in 2 quarts is because if you put in too much, it's heavy.
Yep.
And it's hard to shake. But if you don't put in enough, this stuff actually helps you sifting because it brushes the top of the screen as you're shaking, and that helps to force the castings through. Everything's going back in here will be there for the next harvest. So even if you don't get all the castings, it's still there for the next time.
Yeah.
And then you can also, see how the screen starts to plug up a little bit? You can turn it completely upside down over this black bowl here. You have to give it a few wraps to clean out that screen in between. And then the other thing I'm going to show you is that this stuff here has got quite a bit of moisture in it. And as you put food in here, depending 100% on that diaper underneath to absorb all that extra moisture. So what I normally do is I'll add something dry to it that can soak up that moisture. But the worms need the moist stuff to live in. So you have to have both moist and dry in a sort of a mixture. So I use these dry egg trays that I got from a restaurant. They were throwing these out, so it was waste that I could better recycle this way than just throw it in a dumpster and have it go off to the Eco-Maine incinerator. So. And then to get the last of this out, and use our paintbrush to sweep everything down into one end. If they were wet enough to smear, you wouldn't be able to sift it. So it turns out that the paintbrush is the best tool when you have moist, crumbly worm castings.
Would you just get this from like Lowe's or something?
No, I have to make them.
Oh, really?
There didn't turn out to be a supply of sieves that were really of the size that I was looking for.
Yeah.
So all this is a utility pan that you might use to make to change the oil in your car.
Right. Yeah, that's what it reminds me of.
And cut the bottom out of it, and I glue the hardware cloth, which is the 1/8 square, into the bottom of it. That's how I make the sieves.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay. So now. You could if I had the food. I don't have the food. I could feed this at this point and then put it all back together. I do have food I could go get. Do you want to do that?
Sure.
Okay. I've got this lid on it so flies can't get into it. So after I get the food mix, I have to make sure that the flies don't get in it. So what we have in here is we have the kitchen scraps. Okay, this is all of the stuff that you would normally see coming from the kitchen. And then in addition to that, it's been mixed with some dry material because the food as it decomposes gets wet and you don't want it to be too wet, so I mix in some dry material with it. And what you see in here that looks like shredded something, that's cardboard that's been through one of those shredders there. Okay, so that's another dry material that's added. And then what looks like maybe worm castings is a combination of coffee grounds and dried worm castings that are mixed together to get the moisture of the coffee grounds so they're not too wet.
Yeah.
Because coffee grounds tend to be very wet, and that way your food doesn't get too wet when you add the coffee grounds. So the coffee grounds in here represent about 25% of the food, and then the rest of it, the 75%, is the kitchen scraps, and then that's all mixed with a certain amount of dry material to control the moisture. This one has just been harvested, so we're going to feed them for the next month. That's four quarts of food, and then the worm bin will be closed up in that month. They'll turn all of this stuff into worm castings, and then it will be time to add another 4 quarts of food. Do you remember what went on top of that? That's the old diaper, right? That was on top, holding the moisture in, keeping it dark. And if this gets eaten up by the worms, you have to replace it. That's not gone far enough in terms of being eaten up by the worms, and I'm going to reuse it.
What's the time frame on like harvesting, like what we just did, from like feeding it and putting in the food to harvesting, like what we just did?
Yeah, what I normally do is I'll harvest and feed at the same time. Okay, so I'm putting in 4 quarts of food on the same day that I harvest. Wait 30 days, put in another 4 quarts. Wait 30 days, put in another 4 quarts. So I put in a total of 12.
Yeah.
And then I'll wait 40 days, and then I'll harvest. And then I'll start that cycle over again. So about every 3 to 4 months,
Right.
I harvest. Yeah. And in between, I'm feeding about once every 30 days.
Okay.
All right, so the next thing is to hold the moisture in, because everything below the plastic is moist. So we put that in there to hold that moisture in so it doesn't get dried out on top. And then we're going to keep the light out, and we're going to help to keep the walls dry with the layer of dry newspaper next. And then we put in our preventive fly paper that hopefully will catch any stray fly that gets in there before it has a chance to mate and reproduce. Cover this up with a row cover to keep air going in, and making sure that no flies go in with it. And then I would update my log sheet with whatever I had done today, and then the cover goes on. Now in my worm farm, I actually don't use these covers, but I recommend if you keep this in your house and you have a cat, that you keep the cover on to keep the cat out.
Yeah.
Small kids, same thing.
Right. Yeah.
So that one's ready. It goes back into the worm farm now for 30 days. And then in 30 days, it'll be due for another 4 quarts of food. So just to introduce you to the idea that you can store a lot of worm bins in a relatively small area. There's a lot of shelving here that each shelf will hold 8 worm bins. So very quickly you can store, I have 59 worm bins stored down here, so it's no big deal to put it in a small area in your cellar because you're using the vertical space rather than just floor space. So that was one point I wanted to make in that regard. After you've harvested your worm castings, what I do is I dry them out, and the reason I dry them out is for storage. Worm castings are full of microbes, and the microbes are alive as long as the castings are moist. But when the castings dry out, what happens is the microbes form spores. And so they go into a suspended state of life until you're ready to use them, and then you can use them to either make worm tea or use them as is in the garden to feed plants. So this drying out process has been something I've been working at, and this is the way I'm doing it now. I use a cold brew coffee filter, which is normally used to make cold brew coffee. It's the size that I use is 16 inches on the top by 20 inches long this way, and I use a pail like that to support this when I'm putting the castings into it. So that's all I do to prepare the bag to put the castings into. Now this is a tote that's full of castings just the way they come out of a worm bin. And they're stored here waiting for me to move them from here into the drying process. So they're moist, and the microbes and the fungi in here are all still alive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a measure, and I'm going to measure out into this 7 quarts of moist worm castings. 1, 6, and at that point I have to pull up the sides a little bit to get the 7th quart in. Okay, so now I'm going to close this bag, fold it over on itself this way, and then over a couple of times that way. I'm going to use what's called a tarp clip. These are used to hold tarps. Well, we're going to use it to hold the cold brew coffee filter full of worm castings. And then I would make a little label that would tell me where this came from and how much there was in it, and I would hang that, as you can see here. Okay, so these are all hung, and they start, this particular one started on April 8th, and it will be ready to take down on May 8th. And at 15 days, on the 23rd, I'll take it down and I will put it through the sieve, and that will break up any clumps that are in it. This stuff, as it dries, tends to form some clumps, and after about 15 days, if you break those clumps up, it's dry enough that they don't reform in the next 15 days. And at this point, they'll be dry and they'll be ready to put into a tote like this, which is full of dried worm castings. So the way you go from this, which is the moist worm castings, to this, which is the dry worm castings, is you simply dry them in a cold brew coffee filter for 30 days. You hang them up in their cellar and they just air dry. To make worm tea, all you do is take worm castings, put them in water, and keep that water aerated for 24 to 48 hours. And what's happening is the microbes that were in the worm castings are migrating into the liquid phase, and therefore the tea that you're making can be used on plants, and you get the same benefit from using worm tea as you do from worm castings. And it's a little more convenient if you have, think about a garden and you want to, say, put something, either worm castings or worm tea, on a row that's growing. It's easier to walk down that row with a watering can and water it with tea than it is to side dress all the plants individually with worm castings. So it's a convenience thing as much as anything else. So to make worm tea out of worm castings, this method that I call the shaker method, all I do is take 2 cups of worm castings, put them into a jug that will hold 2 gallons of water. So then I would put 2 gallons of water into this jug, put the top on it, and for the next 24-48 hours I'd shake it once in a while just to get air into that water, so that the microbes, which need the air to survive, will have dissolved oxygen in the water that you're, if you don't shake it and introduce air, eventually they use up all the oxygen that's dissolved in the water, and your system goes anaerobic. The aerobic microbes die, and they're replaced with anaerobic microbes, which don't have the benefit that we're talking about from the aerobic ones. So that's how you make what I call the shaker worm tea. Another way to do this is to use an air pump, and this is a system that's made by T-Lab. And what they have is a fairly good-sized air pump hooked by a plastic hose to this green thing that sits in the bottom of a 5-gallon pail. You plug this in, and it continually bubbles air into your system, and that means that you don't have to do the shaking thing. All right, so there's 2 ways of making worm tea. With this system, the T-Lab system, you put your castings into a tea bag. All right, so they aren't actually in the water, they're in the tea bag. So when you're done with your brewing, you just pull this out and you're left with your worm tea in the bucket to use. With this system, you've still got the solids in it, and to separate the solids from the worm tea, I use another cold brew coffee filter. This is a bigger one. This has 20-inch opening at the top versus the 16, and it fits pretty conveniently inside of a 5-gallon bucket, like so. And when your tea is ready to use, you simply pour the contents of this, which of course has the water and the solids in it, into the tea bag. Your solids stay inside the tea bag and your tea is in the bucket. Now the reason for getting the solids out is if you're using a watering can or you're using a sprayer that has a fine hole in it, if it had solids in it, it would plug that hole. So we have to strain out the solids to make it convenient to use in a shower head type of watering can or in a backpack sprayer. You can use worm tea as a foliar feeder, so you can spray it right on the leaves. The leaves will take the nutrients in directly, and in addition you can wet the soil and the nutrients will be pulled into the plant through the roots. So those are the two ways that you can make worm tea from the dried worm castings that we talked about a minute ago, how you dry the worm casting. You can also make worm tea directly from a worm bin that has worms and everything in it. You can just put everything, the whole contents of a worm bin, worms and all, inside of the tea bag, and make tea directly from the worm bin. So you don't have to actually harvest the castings to make tea that way. This was an experiment that we ran to try to evaluate the different methods of making tea to find out if there was a difference between one method and the other. This is the start of our experiment on June 22nd. All three of these plants were dug up at the same time from the garden and potted, and they're supposed to be all basically the same height. And then we fed this plant the tea lab, which is this device I showed you with the air pump. We fed this plant the tea lab worm tea. We fed this plant what I call the shaker worm tea, which is just putting it into this and shaking it once in a while. And we were looking to see if the difference between this plant and the control, which was just fed water, was significant enough to justify the cost of investing in that kind of a system, where this system here is so inexpensive. You're just putting it into a bucket and shaking it and stirring it up. And we judged that this plant wasn't significantly different than that plant, so we stuck with our shaker method as opposed to investing in this. Now the reason that I had the unit so I could run the experiment. I still use the unit to make worm tea in 32-gallon batches in a garbage can, because that air pump is enough to circulate the air and get it into a large volume of water, where the shaker method only works for a small volume of water. You can't pick up a 32-gallon garbage can full of water and shake it.